She had rehearsed this moment 100 times. She knew what to say at the door, how to let her hand rest in his like a couple who had done this before. Claire Sutton had spent 34 years being the most prepared person in every room she entered. What she did not know, standing at the front door of the Sutton home in Lake Forest with Owen Marsh's hand in hers, was that none of it would matter. Richard Sutton looked at the man beside his daughter and stopped. His face went the color of old ash. And Claire, who had planned everything, had no plan for this. 3 days before that dinner, the call from her father arrived at 7 in the morning, the hour he reserved for announcements he considered beyond appeal. He wanted her home Saturday. He had someone he wanted her to meet. A young man from a family his firm had known for years, someone with roots in commercial real estate, someone who understood the world the Suttons moved in. Claire was standing in her kitchen on the 14th floor of her building on West Erie Street, looking out at the November skyline. She was 34 years old. She ran 41 employees and a 7-figure annual budget. She had not asked her father to evaluate her personal life in over a decade. She told him no. He did not argue. He let a pause stand between them, the particular silence he had developed over 64 years of knowing when to press and when to let pressure accumulate on its own. Then he told her about the paperwork, an equity restructuring agreement that would transfer 18% of Sutton & Lowe's stock into a holding vehicle under his control should Claire demonstrate what the document called a pattern of personal instability. He said the attorneys had been specific in their language. Claire asked him what he was actually saying. He said he hoped to see her Saturday. She hung up and called her assistant, Nora, within 4 minutes. She told Nora she needed a man for Saturday evening, someone presentable, calm, not the kind to ask too many questions. Someone with a reason to want money and the self-possession not to make the evening about himself. Nora went quiet in the way she did when she was deciding something. She said she might know someone. Owen Marsh had done carpentry work for Sutton & Lowe's Fulton Market office renovation 11 months earlier, the walnut shelving wall in the main conference room. The piece every client paused to look at. Nora remembered him because he was the only contractor who had consistently arrived before 8 and left without being asked. Claire had been traveling for most of the renovation. She had no clear memory of his face, only of the shelving. Nora called him. He declined before she reached the end of the explanation. Claire called Owen herself that evening. She told him the number plainly. He said the answer was still no. She said she understood, and then, because Nora had mentioned a daughter, she told him the money was real and she hoped he would reconsider. He asked what exactly was expected. She said 1 dinner, 4 hours, introduced as her partner of 6 months. He would not be asked to claim anything flatly untrue. She would handle the difficult questions. He said he would think about it. He called back in 20 minutes and said yes. They met the next afternoon at a coffee shop on Milwaukee Avenue. Claire arrived early with a folded piece of paper, biographical details to memorize, a first meeting story, 2 constructed memories for her mother, who always asked about these things. She slid it across the table. Owen read it without rushing, folded it once, and set it back down. He asked one question, whether her father was afraid of something in her, or whether it was the other way around. Claire said they should go over the timeline. Owen held her gaze a second, then leaned back and said, "All right." He arrived at her building Saturday at 5:15 in a black Ford pickup with a dent above the rear wheel well, the interior smelling like sawdust and something faintly resinous. Claire came out in her wool coat and low heels and stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the truck, then at him. He was in dark trousers and a gray button-down, collar open, no jacket despite the cold. He looked exactly right in a way she had not anticipated, not dressed up, not performing, simply himself and unself-conscious about it. She looked at the truck again. He said she could have a real boyfriend or one who leased a nice car, but not both in the same person. Claire said nothing and opened the passenger door herself. The drive north took 35 minutes in light early evening traffic. The highway followed the lake for a stretch. the water dark and flat to the east, the last of the November light gone to a thin gray band at the horizon. Claire told him about her family in pieces efficiently and without sentiment. Her father had started in residential development in the 80s and moved into commercial acquisition in the 90s. His firm now controlled properties across 6 counties in the greater Chicago metro area. He was careful and patient, and very rarely wrong about what a piece of land would be worth in 10 years. 2 modes, expansion and control. He had never found a use for a third. Her mother, Margaret, had been a landscape architect before she stopped working when Claire was born. Warm, curious, genuinely interested in the lives of the people around her. Claire said her mother was the most skilled person she had ever known at enduring, and she said it without elaboration, the way people said things they had stopped needing to explain. Owen drove and did not fill the silences she left. He did not offer sympathy or analysis. He asked once, quietly, whether her father had ever done something like this before, attached a professional consequence to a personal demand, made the two impossible to separate. Claire said, not with legal documents. He nodded. After a moment, he asked what she thought her father was actually trying to accomplish. She said she had been asking herself that since the phone call. Sometimes she thought it was control. Other times she thought it was fear, the particular fear of a man who had spent his life building structures and now sensed that the most important one, the one that bore his name, was not fully under his authority. She said she was not sure those were different things. Owen said nothing to that, and they moved through the northern suburbs in quiet, the houses growing larger and farther apart, the streets quieter, the light from the windows of each house warmer and more contained. When he turned through the gate onto the gravel drive, she glanced at him. He was looking at the house through the windshield, the 3-story Georgian facade lit warmly from inside, the formal gardens bare and dark in the November cold, the stone entry steps pale under the porch lights. She had started to say something about parking when she noticed his hands on the wheel. His knuckles had gone white, the tendons standing out against the skin. It lasted only a moment. He exhaled slowly, his grip opened and relaxed, and he eased the truck forward toward the house. Claire looked back at the windshield and told herself it was nerves. She did not consider that it might be something else entirely. Richard Sutton opened the front door before they had reached the top step. He was 64, tall and lean, silver hair well cut, his posture carrying the exactness of a man who had made a lifetime practice of presenting himself precisely. He wore a sport coat over a collared shirt with no tie, the studied casualness of a man who wanted the impression of relaxation. He opened the door, and his gaze moved to Claire first, the quick survey he had always performed, checking her, taking her in, and then shifted to Owen. And there it stopped. 3 seconds, perhaps less, but Claire had spent her entire adult life studying a face that prided itself on revealing nothing. And what moved across it in those 3 seconds was not nothing. The color pulled back from his face in a single visible recession, the way color left things when the blood behind them made a sudden decision. His hand on the doorframe tightened. His breath did not come out visibly, which meant he had stopped it. His eyes fixed on Owen with an expression Claire could not immediately name, because she had genuinely never seen it on him before. It was not anger. It was not the cold assessment he used on people he was deciding about. It was the expression of a man encountering something he believed he had put safely behind him, and understanding, in real time, that he had been wrong. Whatever had passed between this man and her father had not happened in a boardroom. It had happened somewhere older and more permanent than business, and the weight of it was in Richard Sutton's face now for anyone to see if anyone was paying close enough attention. Then Margaret appeared at his shoulder, already smiling, already saying Claire's name with the warm emphasis she always used, and the moment fractured. Margaret stepped forward to embrace her daughter. Richard released the doorframe and stepped back, and Owen extended his hand. They shook. The grip lasted a beat too long, firm in the way that was specific and deliberate, the grip of a man confirming something physical. Owen did not flinch and did not look away. He met the grip and held it and looked at Richard with an expression that was steady and calm and contained something Claire could not read from where she was standing. Two men in a doorway, a handshake that lasted 1 full second longer than any social occasion required. Between them, in that second, something passed that neither of them had spoken aloud. Richard said it was good to meet him. His voice was level and gave nothing at all. The entry hall was marble-floored and double-height, furnished with the quiet certainty of very old money pieces chosen not to impress, but to simply exist as though they had always been there. Margaret took their coats and asked about traffic and said the salmon had been in for 40 minutes, so the timing was perfect. Owen moved through the space without performing any reaction. He did not register the scale of the rooms or the art on the walls with any visible response, not conspicuously unmoved, which would have been its own kind of performance, but genuinely unbothered, as though the contents of the room were not the thing he had come here to understand. He simply took it in and kept walking. Claire watched her father watch him do this, and saw in her father's face something she could not quite name. Not suspicion, exactly. Attention. The concentrated, particular attention of a man who was looking at something he already knew something about. At the dinner table, the questions did not come. When Claire had been in a serious relationship at 27, her father had spent the first 20 minutes running what she privately called the interview education, career trajectory, family background, the particular way he had of asking about a man's ambitions that was designed to reveal whether they were genuine or performed. He had done this with everyone she had ever brought home, without exception, and it was as automatic as breathing. He did not do it with Owen. He poured the wine. He asked Claire about work. He commented on the weather coming in from the northwest. He did not ask Owen Marsh a single orienting question, not what he did, not where he had gone to school, not how he had met Claire, not what his plans were. He watched him the way a person watched something they already knew enough about. Margaret asked the questions. She asked about Owen's work with genuine interest, her chin resting in one hand, her wine barely touched. Owen described what he did with the specificity of someone who had spent a long time getting good at it, the walnut shelving in the Fulton Market office, how different wood species moved under Chicago's humidity changes, a kitchen remodel he had recently finished, with reclaimed oak salvaged from a demolished schoolhouse in Pilsen. He was specific and unhurried, and talked about his craft the way people talked about things they had chosen, rather than things that had simply happened to them. Then Margaret asked about his daughter. Something shifted in Owen's face, not softening exactly, but honesty at a different frequency. He said Lily was 7, in 2nd grade at a public school in Logan Square, currently in a phase of drawing that had taken over every flat surface in the apartment. He said she had named her stuffed rabbit Gerald, one eye missing, washed so many times the belly fur had gone down to a thin velvet, and she treated him with the seriousness one extended to a very old friend. He said she drew before school every morning. He said she had her mother's hands. Claire had not written any of this on the briefing document. She had planned a managed performance, 2 professionals executing a shared fiction with competence. What was unfolding at this table was not a performance. Owen was not playing a version of himself. He was simply present, and the contrast with everything Claire had scripted and arranged made her feel, for a moment, that she was the only person at the table doing something artificial. She watched him across the table and felt something she did not immediately recognize. She picked up her wine and brought herself back to the room. Richard had gone still. His fork moved on his plate, but with the mechanical quality of hands doing what they did, while the rest of him was somewhere else. His wine glass stayed full at his right hand. He did not appear to look at Owen directly, but Claire had the impression, watching from the corner of her eye, that he was looking at Owen constantly, in the careful, peripheral way of a man who did not want to be caught doing it. Near the end of the meal, when the conversation had found a kind of surface ease, Margaret had been talking about a garden project she was planning for the spring. Owen had asked a question about soil drainage that she answered with visible pleasure. Richard set down his fork and said pleasantly that he and Claire might step out for a moment. Some family matter he had not gotten around to. He said it the way he said things that were not questions but were dressed as questions out of habit. Owen said, of course, and Margaret immediately turned to him and began something about the summer Claire had refused to take swimming lessons. Claire followed her father into the hallway. The study was off the main corridor, dark paneled. The walls lined floor to ceiling with books that had actually been read. Richard closed the door behind them and stood by the window without turning on the overhead light. The desk lamp threw a low, warm circle onto the surface below it. In that light, he looked older than usual and also, Claire thought, more recognizably himself, not the version he presented in rooms full of people, but the version that remained when the room was small enough that presentation wasn't worth the effort. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked out the window at the dark garden for a moment before he spoke. He did not mention the young man from the family his firm had known. He did not mention the equity agreement or anything that had been said on the phone 3 days ago. He said Owen Marsh's name, the way he said names he was examining carefully, slowly, giving each syllable its own weight, the way you handled something you were trying to understand the dimensions of. He asked Claire how long she had known him. She said 6 months, give or take. Through a project connection, the way things happened in her industry. She kept her voice easy and her hands open on her lap. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he said she should be careful with him. He said it without elaboration, without the explanation that would have made it a warning rather than simply a statement dropped into the room without a frame around it. He said not every person was who one assumed them to be, and left those words standing. He opened the study door. His manner in the hallway was smooth and composed, as though nothing had been said in the room they had just left. Claire walked back toward the living room and stopped in the doorway. Owen was on the couch across from Margaret, turned toward her, and Margaret was laughing not the careful laugh she produced at dinner parties, but the real one Claire had known since childhood, the one that involved her whole face and made her look briefly like someone much younger. Owen was smiling in a way that reached his eyes. He was not performing interest. He was simply present in the room with her mother, and her mother was happy in a way she rarely appeared in company her husband had assembled around her. Claire stood in the doorway and felt something she had not anticipated. She had spent the entire evening managing a performance, the lines she had rehearsed, the timeline she had memorized, the controlled presentation of a relationship that did not exist. She had done this kind of management her whole adult life, in boardrooms and negotiations and the careful social arithmetic of her father's world. She was good at it. It was only standing here in this doorway, watching her mother laugh at something Owen had said, that she felt the full strangeness of it, the realization that the only unmanaged thing that had happened in this house all evening was happening between a man she had hired 2 days ago and a woman who had been performing. Contentment in this house for 40 years. For the first time in the entire evening, she looked at the 3 people in this house, her father in his study, her mother on the couch, this man she had found through a work order, and genuinely could not say with confidence which of them she actually knew. After Richard and Margaret said their good nights, Margaret with warmth, Richard with the composed brevity he reserved for transitions, the house settled into quiet. Owen and Claire remained in the living room. The fire had burned to its last red stage, too low to add wood and too stubborn to go out. The lamps threw warm pools against the ceiling. The house creaked occasionally with the cold. Owen took his phone from his pocket and set it on the cushion beside him. Face up, the lock screen was a photograph of a little girl in afternoon light, a sketchbook open in her lap, her face turned toward something outside the frame. The light on her was gold and very soft. Claire asked how old the photo was. Owen said 6 months. He said Lily was working on something she called a big project, a book about a rabbit who could talk but chose not to, because most people didn't listen well enough. He said she had her mother's hands. He said it a second time in one evening without apparent awareness that he had already said it, which told Claire it was not something he said for effect. It was simply something he thought and occasionally said aloud. Claire asked about Diane. She did not decide to ask. The question arrived before she had screened it. She was aware, the moment it was out, that it was not on any list she had written, and that she was asking because she wanted to know, and not for any other reason. Owen was quiet for a moment. He said Diane had died. When Lily was 18 months old, a blood clot. A Tuesday in March. Lily at daycare. Owen at a job in Evanston. Diane alone in their apartment before the ambulance arrived. Lily had no memory of her at all. He had framed photographs in every room at heights Lily could see from her own eye level, so she could grow up knowing what her mother looked like. What she looked like when she laughed. He said it the way people said things. They had made a deliberate practice of surviving. Claire asked whether it had gotten easier. Owen said easier was not quite the right word. Some things stopped hurting with the same constant frequency, and other things did not. And what you learned over time was which was which. You accounted for them the way a carpenter accounted for a knot in the wood. You didn't remove it. You worked with what it was. Then, he looked at her directly. He asked whether she was asking because she wanted to understand, or whether knowing that someone had lost something made her feel steadier about the things she had never lost. Claire opened her mouth and closed it. She looked at the low fire. She did not have an answer. She was not a person who was frequently without answers, and the sensation was not entirely unpleasant. She was still looking at the fire when Owen reached into his pocket and removed a small, folded piece of paper. Not her briefing document, this was older. The paper softened at the creases from years of folding. The ink faded at the edges. He looked at it without opening it, just held it for a second as though confirming it was still there. Then he folded it once and put it back. In that second, Claire had seen the address written on it. She recognized it immediately. 1400 block, North Sheridan Road. Lake Forest. This house. She started to speak. Owen asked where the guest bathroom was. Naturally, the way a person asked a question they actually needed answered, and she found herself saying second door on the left, before she understood that the question had replaced the one she had been about to ask. He thanked her and walked down the hall, and she sat alone by the dying fire with a feeling she could not name. She lay awake in her childhood bedroom for a long time. The room was cold in the way guest rooms went cold in houses where the family no longer slept on that floor. She looked at the ceiling she had stared at as a teenager, and she thought about the paper in his pocket, what it meant that he had carried this address with him, and what it meant that his knuckles had gone white on the wheel when they came through the gate. Just after 1 in the morning, she got up for water and moved carefully in the dark hallway. She had reached the top of the stairs when she stopped. Her father was standing in the downstairs hallway at the threshold of the open living room door, motionless in his robe. The thin light from the hallway window fell across his face at an angle that showed her his expression clearly. She had seen her father's face in anger, which was cold and surgical, in satisfaction, which was quiet and complete, in the deliberate neutrality he used when closing something that had cost him more than he intended to show. She had never seen it look like this. He was looking into that room with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something to arrive for a very long time and has spent that time hoping it would not. Claire came down the stairs without announcing herself. Her father heard her at the bottom step and turned slightly, but did not speak. She came to stand beside him and looked through the open door. Owen was asleep on the couch, one arm resting across his chest, breathing slow and even. He looked, in sleep, like someone who had learned to rest wherever he was, who did not require specific conditions for peace. She said to her father, quietly, that he knew Owen Marsh. She did not make it a question. Richard looked into the living room a moment longer. Then he moved to the kitchen and she followed, and he sat at the table without turning on the light, the same table where he had once explained to his daughter, very patiently, why the world operated the way it did. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not speak at all. Then he did. He said that 12 years ago he had acquired a parcel of land in Naperville, 2 acres with a woodworking shop attached, a family business 20 years in operation. The documentation had been clean. What it had not reflected, what Richard had known and told himself could be separated from the transaction, was that the man who signed the transfer papers had done so in a condition that made the signature a legal fiction. He had been in the early stages of a medical deterioration. He had not understood what he was releasing. No family member had been present. The attorneys were on retainer to Richard's firm. The man's name had been Gerald Marsh. He had lost the land and the shop and the house within 90 days of the closing. He had died of a stroke 6 months later. His son had been 25 years old at the time, recently married, and had spent the 12 years since rebuilding from nothing. Richard said all of this quietly, in the dark kitchen, at the table where he had once explained to his daughter why the world operated the way it did. He said he had never met the Marsh family. He had never seen Owen's face. He had only ever known the name on the paper. Claire sat across from her father and understood several things at once. Why Owen's knuckles had gone white at the wheel when they came through the gate, why he had looked at the house with that particular quality of attention, why he kept photographs at Lily's eye level in every room, why a little girl's stuffed rabbit was named Gerald, and why a man with every reason to say no had called back in 20 minutes and said yes. He had carried the address here, not as a weapon. He had carried it because some things you carry until you can finally put them down. In the early morning, before the house woke, Claire found Owen in the kitchen. He had made coffee and was standing at the counter looking out at the backyard gray and frost, covered in the thin pre-dawn light, the bare oaks at the property's edge still and dark against the sky. She poured a cup and sat at the table and told him what her father had told her in the night. Owen listened without turning from the window. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Then he said he had known who she was before Nora called. He said when the name Sutton and Lowe came through, he had not dismissed it. He had looked at it and known exactly what he was looking at. He had sat with it for 20 minutes, not deciding whether to say yes, but deciding what he hoped to find if he did. He had spent 12 years with a story that had no face attached to it. He knew what had been done. He knew the name of the man who had done it. He had the legal documents, the closing records, the dated paper trail that described, in the bloodless language of real estate transactions, the systematic dismantling of his father's life. But he had never been able to place a living person at the end of that chain of decisions. He wanted to see Richard Sutton, not through documentation, not through what others said about him. In a room, in person, he wanted to know whether this was a man who had made a calculation and moved on without looking back, or a man who had never fully gotten past it, who carried it the way Owen had been carrying his own version of the same event, quietly, constantly, without the relief of being finished with it. He said he had not expected to find anything that changed the answer. He turned from the window and looked at her across the kitchen. The pre-dawn light was pale and thin, and made the room feel provisional, like something not yet fully settled. He said he had not expected her. He had expected to walk into the Sutton house and find it sealed and composed, everyone in their assigned position. Instead, he had found that Richard Sutton's daughter had no knowledge of what her father had done. She had not been protecting him. She had simply never been told. And in a house full of managed surfaces, her father's composure, her mother's careful warmth, the whole practiced ease of the evening, she was the only person who was simply being herself, not calculating what she let others see, not managing the room, just present and honest in the way people were honest when they forgot to be anything else. He said that was not something he had planned for. He said he was not entirely sure what to do with it. Claire looked at him across the kitchen table in the pale light before sunrise. She thought about the briefing document she had written on a piece of paper that was now somewhere at the bottom of her bag. She thought about the 7 items in 2 columns, the invented memories, the timeline she had rehearsed on the drive up. She thought about all the rooms in her life she had walked into prepared, and what it had felt like to stand in the doorway of the living room last night and understand that the one thing she had not prepared for was the possibility that the person she had hired to perform sincerity would simply be sincere. She did not say any of this. She picked up her coffee cup. Outside the kitchen window, the frost on the grass caught the first pale gray of the morning, and the bare oaks held very still, and neither of them moved toward the door. That same afternoon, after a breakfast that no one ate with full attention, Claire asked her father into the study and closed the door. She had been on her laptop until 4 in the morning, working through the company's historical transaction archive, the same records portal she had built when she overhauled the firm's documentation system, requiring all predecessor entity records to be digitized and retained. She had found the closing documents for the Naperville acquisition. She had found the internal communication chain between her father's acquisitions team and the attorneys who had handled the closing. And she had found a memo dated, signed, filed in the ordinary way of memos that documented things nobody wanted to discuss, in which a paralegal had explicitly flagged that the signatory appeared to be in diminished condition and in which she had been instructed, in writing, to proceed. She placed the printed pages on the desk between them without speaking. Richard looked at the documents for a long time without touching them. Then he said he knew. He had always known, from the day it was done. He said there was a category of decision a man made in the course of building something large, and you told yourself the category was business, and the telling got easier with time. The knowing did not go away. He said he had been waiting for some version of this moment for 12 years, and that the waiting had been its own form of consequence, quiet, persistent, never finished. He looked up at his daughter. He said he had told himself, across those 12 years, that he had no way of tracing what had happened to the Marsh family after the transaction closed, that the terms had been what they were and the outcome had been unfortunate but not his to account for at a distance. He said he had composed that version of events with some care and had maintained it with some effort, and that none of the effort had ever entirely worked. Claire looked at her father in the low light of the study and understood something she had not understood before. She had grown up watching him fill rooms the way he entered them, the way conversations organized themselves around him, the way he made decisions land with the weight of things already decided. She had always understood this as authority. She understood now that there was something else underneath it, something that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with the particular stillness of a person who had learned to hold very still to keep something from spilling. She told him what Owen wanted. Not money. Not a public statement. Not a settlement that would make everything official and therefore manageable at arm's length. Owen wanted Richard Sutton to come to his workshop, the one in Bridgeport, on South Halsted, the one Owen had been building back one job at a time for a decade. He wanted Richard to walk through the door and look at what had been made of what was left after Naperville. And he wanted Richard to say, directly, face to face, without lawyers or papers between them, what he had done. Richard sat with this for a moment. Then he nodded once. It was the smallest possible movement. It contained everything. Claire walked out and told Owen, who was waiting in the living room with his jacket already in hand. He listened. He said, "All right." He found Margaret, who had come out of the kitchen, and he shook her hand and thanked her for dinner and for the company. Margaret held his hand between both of hers and told him to drive carefully. It was the thing she said to people she wanted to see again. Owen left without turning back, and Claire stood in the entry hall and watched the front door settle closed and felt the particular quiet of a house that has just had something real happen inside it. 6 weeks passed. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of January, Claire drove west into Bridgeport with Owen's address from the company's vendor records. She parked on South Halsted and sat in the car for a moment. She had not called ahead. She told herself it was because the shop might not have posted hours. She knew, reaching for her bag, that this was not the actual reason. She pushed the workshop door open and stepped inside. The space was mid-sized and high-ceilinged, the concrete floor worn smooth, natural light falling through north-facing windows near the top of the wall. It smelled like sawdust and linseed oil. At the main workbench, Owen was running a hand plane along the face of a wide board in long, even strokes. In the far corner, at a small table beside a space heater, Lily sat bent over a sketchbook with a green crayon. Owen looked up when Claire stepped in. He set the hand plane down and waited. Claire held up the folder she had brought. She said she had been putting off a full office remodel, custom shelving along the south wall, a built-in cabinet unit behind the main desk, a credenza in quarter-sawn white oak. She set the folder on the workbench. He read through what she had written: joinery specifications, finish preferences, dimensional drawings, reference photographs. He said she understood this would be 8 weeks, minimum. She said she understood. He said the estimate would take a few days. She said that was fine. He looked at her across the workbench in the clear, steady way she had come to recognize as how he paid attention. He said, "All right." From the far corner, Lily had been watching with the peripheral attention of a child who knew the interesting things happened just outside the main event. She looked up at her father, then at Claire, and asked simply, directly, whether this was a real friend. Owen looked at Claire. Claire heard the question land. She did not answer it. She picked up the spare stool and sat down beside Lily. Lily gave her the frank look of a child deciding something, then turned back to her sketchbook. The page showed a small house with a chimney trailing smoke, and in front of the door, 3 figures, no names, drawn with the confidence of a child who drew to clarify. The house looked as though it belonged entirely to them. Owen had gone back to the handplane. The sound of it moving along the board was long and even, and the space heater ticked softly. Outside the high windows, the January sky was pale. Claire sat beside a 7-year-old in a workshop that smelled like sawdust and the work of a man who had spent 12 years rebuilding what was taken from him. She did not reach for her phone. She sat with where she was, and for the first time in longer than she could honestly say, that was enough.